It's the start of the new year, and if politics is your thing, what better way to kick things off than at the state capitol for the start of the annual legislative session?
My word for this session is transparency, just making sure that our constituents, our voters, know what's going on, what we're doing.
For the next 4 months, Colorado's 100 lawmakers will gather under the Gold Dome to pass laws that touch on all aspects of life in this state, from schools and healthcare to roads and prisons.
And they'll have to do something no politician finds easy: cut back on spending. A lot.
It'll be unprecedented. It's going to be extremely challenging.
This is the first session I'm going in where we're really in a cut mode, and it's going to be a bummer.
We just flat out overextended, and we knew this was coming.
And all this work to shape Colorado's future, of course, is happening at the same time our entire country embarks on a new political reality.
What does it mean to be this blue island in a sea of red? And what can we anticipate from a Trump administration?
I think there are a lot of individuals who are they're telling themselves stories of what may happen, and they're responding to something that may happen. I think let's actually see what happens first.
There's a lot that could happen, and a lot that lawmakers are getting ready to make happen. And all that means that here, in the dead of winter, Colorado's politics are about to really heat up. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capitol News Alliance, a podcast about Colorado politics, policy, and starting now, the 2025 state legislative session. I'm Benta Birkeland, and you're hearing a new voice here with me on the mic.
Hi, I'm Lucas Brady Woods, state capitol reporter for KUNC, the public radio station for Northern Colorado. I am really excited to be here.
And we are so excited to have you. And I'm really thrilled because this episode marks the start of a new beginning for the show and for state political coverage in Colorado. Because as I just mentioned, Purplish is now part of the Capitol News Alliance.
The Alliance is a joint project of my station, KUNC, plus CPR, also the Colorado Sun, Rocky Mountain PBS, and Rocky Mountain Community Radio, funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The goal here is that by working together, we can deliver more and better coverage of Colorado politics to everyone in Colorado.
And we'll have a lot more voices from the Alliance on Purplish in coming episodes. And I have to say, Lucas, every time I say Alliance, I'm picturing Star Wars. Are we the Rebel Alliance? Who came up with this name for us?
I mean, I welcome any reference to Star Wars and really do, as a journalist, already see myself as Luke Skywalker. So, this is right along the lines of what I want to do anyway.
Does that mean we have to use a lot more Polis Yoda impersonations in future Purplish episodes?
That remains to be seen, but maybe.
Yeah. So let's join forces here. And we will look at what lies ahead for this upcoming session.
Yeah, you and I have been spending the past few weeks talking with lawmakers about what they're working on and worrying about, frankly, from their big bills to that big hole in the state budget.
This is the first time all of these lawmakers will be together after the election, and it's just an especially interesting, kind of an exciting time. We have a lot of new faces, some familiar faces and new roles, and that means the dynamics of how things get done are going to change.
So, a new start for the legislature and a new start for Purplish. Let's get into it.
We're going into this legislative session with a lot that's changed and a lot that hasn't.
One thing the election didn't change is that Democrats are still solidly in control of both chambers.
That's right. But, Republicans are also pretty relieved about their overall situation. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're still in the minority, but at least they're not in the super minority. And as one person pointed out to me, and I hadn't even thought about it quite this way, but this is the first election in a decade that Republicans have actually gained ground at the State House.
Wow, that's a significant way to look at it for sure. In the House, they won 3 seats, and in the Senate, they held steady when they were afraid they actually might lose seats in places where voters have been going more Democratic. But again, the Senate has the same numbers that it did last year. And when I talked with Senate Minority Leader Paul Lundeen, he sees a real message in the election results.
I would argue that demonstrates the people of Colorado are saying, you know what, those Republicans who got elected from lean Democrat seats, that's kind of the future of what Colorado should be looking like. So I'm thinking our message is resonating with the people of Colorado.
What did Lundeen say specifically he thinks that Republican message was that won some of those seats?
Really, in a nutshell, that Democrats are to blame for the high cost of living in our state. Lundeen's counterpart in the House, Minority Leader Rose Puglisi, says
it's the nickel and diming of Coloradans, and they're tired of it. And I think there's an opportunity to have those conversations as to how we can, in very small ways, really make a substantial impact in the pocketbooks of people.
Of course, Republicans are still in the minority, but not being a super minority does mean they will have a few more seats on House committees. They'll also be able to block Democrats from unilaterally putting amendments on the ballot. So they did make some tangible gains with this election.
Benta, you've been talking with Democrats. Do they feel like voters were sending them a message?
Not really, not at the state level. They still are in charge of state government. And Democrats disagree a little bit with Lundeen here. They say the close races they lost, a lot of them were in more conservative areas. One House race, the closest race at the legislature, was decided by 3 votes. That's 3 votes.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyone who says their vote doesn't matter, just look at this election. But 3 votes, I don't know how you can get closer than that. And they held on to a number of competitive seats. They feel it shows that Coloradans are generally happy with the direction of the state and how things are going with Democrats in charge.
I think it's because we protect our vulnerable folks and we respect women, and, so we had on the ballot marriage equality and abortion, and we were the only state with a gun measure, and it passed handily.
That was Democratic Representative Meg Froelich, and that gun measure she was talking about is Proposition KK, and that would put a new excise tax on guns and ammunition to support aid for crime victims, among others, and she was a big proponent of that and worked on that issue a lot.
Of course, though, what happened in state elections is really only a small piece of the picture, right? Because this Democratic majority will be passing laws at the same time the second Trump administration is starting work in Washington.
And that's definitely on lawmakers' minds. Democrats told me they're really worried how far Trump will go in some of the promises he's made to remake the federal government and what that will mean for Colorado. When I talked to Jennifer Bacon, the Assistant House Majority Leader, she said she actually hopes Trump will get her party to unify around things that are really important to them.
We may find some real focus. So myself, in addition to working on things that I typically work on, I am part of the crew that's just kind of like, okay, if the EPA ceases to exist, what are we going to do?
And not just getting rid of the EPA, Trump has said he's going to do a whole slew of things, and his administration could have a big impact on things like the future of Colorado River water, for example.
I think another thing, and I know we'll both be watching this, is what happens with immigration policy. One of the main pillars of President Trump's campaign, a reason a lot of people voted for him. We've been a little bit of a focal point already. Trump held a rally in Aurora based on things he thought were happening in Colorado. He's vowed to deport criminal immigrants and call it Operation Aurora. And how that will interplay with locals here and what the legislature may want to do. Well, we'll have to see how that plays out and if it goes the way Trump has said it's going to.
You and I were both at that rally, and it was big. There were a lot of people there. That was pretty significant. Like you said, he came here when we're not even a swing state, but he still felt the need to come here and highlight that. But Benta, you covered the Capitol during the last Trump administration, right? I've only been here for a couple of years. Do you remember the last Trump administration having a big impact on what lawmakers did here in Colorado during the legislative session?
Lucas, I barely remember the most recent legislative session, so this is going back into my memory book, but I don't remember off the top of my head if it had an overall theme. One thing I did know was at the start of that session, because President Trump had been very anti-media and talking about fake news and really elevating that term in a way it had never been elevated or used before. Republican leaders in our state Senate were going to go un-Trump with the media, and they tried to work closely with the press and say, we respect the job you're doing, and try to be collegial and keep those lines of communication open. So they were trying to do things differently than Trump had been doing at the national level. I think I've seen more reaction to Trump's policies maybe since 2020 when he lost that election. One thing I've covered a lot of, election integrity and claims that the election was stolen, and what Democrats have done to try to build more transparency and show that the voting system is safe and secure.
I would totally agree with that, because even in the couple of years that I've been covering the legislature, I've seen lawmakers pass laws that are attempts to counter policies by the Trump administration, mostly by countering things that the Supreme Court has done on reproductive rights or what they could do on other issues. But I've definitely seen those in the last couple of years too. So I think they have responded to the Trump administration or his policies, whether directly or indirectly, through the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we may see that even more in the next session or two, that Democrats will try to get in front of what they think may happen. But it could also be the case that what happens in D.C. is the least of Colorado lawmakers' worries. We've got a lot of stuff that they're dealing with closer to home, and we're going to get to all of that in a moment. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capitol News Alliance.
You crave conversations about Colorado, the way it works, and the whys behind it. You get more of that in the Colorado Matters podcast.
How do you take a nuclear weapon from 1970 and make it modern?
If we're making decisions based on data, I would say the FDA is not following the data.
This is a homegrown film. This is a love letter to Colorado.
Find Colorado Matters every day, everywhere you get podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capitol News Alliance. Lucas, I think it's fair to say this session already has a theme. It's not something that will be revealed as session unfolds. It's here, it's ready, it's waiting, and that theme is budget.
Yeah, there's currently a more than $600 million hole in next year's budget, plus some holes they have to fill from last year's budget that was already approved. It's no small task.
No, and it's weird. It's a cut, it's a hole, but at the same time, the economy is growing, so expenses are anticipated just to grow by more than the state will have money to spend. So that means cuts.
It's a weird situation, though. The state economy is technically doing just fine, but the state budget is in a recession. Why is that?
I mean, yeah, it's other times I've covered big budget cuts. It's been because there's a recession and there's just less money coming in. So this is different. One thing I've heard from a lot of people is you can't underestimate the impact of the federal COVID relief money going away. That brought billions of dollars into the state. Lawmakers knew it was not going to be ongoing funding, and they, I think, really did try to use it for one-time expenses as much as they could. But as one person told me, it was just so much money. And clearly that money going away does have an impact on the overall budget, as we're going to see this next session.
For Republicans, this means there's a bit of a sense of I told you so right now. And that's certainly the sense I got from Senate Minority Leader Paul Lundeen.
We stood in the well. Those of us who said, be careful, do not use this one-time money in a way that hires an individual or creates a program that will require future funding. You know what happened with all that one-time money? It hired individuals and created programs that need. So now we have a structural deficit and everybody's looking at each other saying, oh my gosh, how did this happen?
So Benta, any sense of how this actually did happen?
I think one thing that plays into it is that certainly lawmakers knew this wasn't ongoing funds. But when you use one-time money for certain things, that may free up other parts of the budget. And so that could be used for ongoing appropriations.
Democrats, they push back a little bit, but also say that these programs that they passed and implemented were needed by the people of Colorado. So it sounds like they found themselves in a difficult situation.
And there's certain time constraints. There's a couple $100 million of COVID relief money that has to be spent right now or the state loses it. So they didn't have tons of leeway on when and how to spend this money. One other thing I've heard from both sides that it's a big issue driving up some of these costs were projections on Medicaid spending. those were off. And so the Medicaid spending has gone way up. There's fewer people in the Medicaid program, but they're using it a lot more. The state isn't sure why. I talked to one person who said they think this is happening nationally, so Colorado's not unique here, but they're trying to figure out what's going on.
Doesn't Tabor also play into this and the Taxpayer Bill of Rights? Doesn't that also constrain lawmakers in some ways when it comes to the budget?
That plays a huge role. I mean, Tabor restricts how much the state budget can grow. So it can only grow by population plus inflation. So population growth and inflation. And when Governor Polis presented his budget proposal to lawmakers in November, he talked about this inflationary piece. And he said, look, because inflation's lower now, which he said is a good thing, he said that's harder for the budget because we can't grow it as much.
So there's a lot of factors that have gotten us here with the budget, right? We just went over them, whether that's the end of COVID funding, Medicaid spending, or Tabor constraints, Taxpayer Bill of Rights constraints. A lot have got us here. And like you said, Polis presented his proposal on how to fix this, how to make cuts so that we can get back to a balanced budget. He presented that to the Joint Budget Committee, but they were not too receptive of his proposal.
I would say that's right. I mean, and this is the most generous way to possibly describe it, is extremely lukewarm, but even then that may be too generous.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of concerns. Democrats were worried it would hurt vulnerable populations, especially with Medicaid provider rate cuts in targeted areas, concerns that it could hit education funding. The governor had proposed privatizing Pinnacle Assurance, and that is the insurer of last resort for workers' compensation. Lawmakers weren't sold on that idea. Polis said, look, come up with your own ideas. This is a tough situation. We've done the best we can. Said, I'm open to working with all of you. But when I talked to Barbara Kirkmeyer, one of the senators, a Republican who sits on the committee, she said she thought the request wasn't worth the paper it's printed on.
The request that the governor sent to us, honestly, and I say this all due respect, isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It's going to change. I don't think the governor, as you'll be able to tell by my other comments, that they were very serious about how are we going to meet critical needs and also balance the budget.
So it is just still the beginning of the budget process.
And just to take a step back for a moment, let's explain that process, right? So this Joint Budget Committee is made up of 6 senators and representatives, and it meets all year to write the budget each year. It spends a lot of time on it. It's a very complicated process. And once they come up with their budget, the rest of the legislature basically just rubber stamps it in March is when this budget is completed and passed generally by the rest of the legislature.
I mean, they'll take exception to the rubber stamp piece, but yes. I think to your point, it's a huge budget, and by the time it gets to the full legislature, there's some minor tweaks here and there, but a lot of stuff is pretty set, and it's kind of like, I don't know, a Rubik's Cube. You move one little thing and it changes 10, 20 other things. So it's just very intricate. Each caucus, there's a majority Democrat on the committee now, but each caucus, they select members to really be their representative, their eyes and ears on this committee. I've talked to other lawmakers who say they still want to know more about what's happening, especially when there are these cuts. Democratic Senator Chris Kolker told me that he's trying to sit in on budget committee meetings when he can and listen in, try to get all the documents, even though that's not his official job. And he said some other members of the caucus are doing that too. He doesn't want it to just be, here's the budget committee proposal, kind of take it or leave it.
Everyone knows that we're in a budget shortfall, and I want to make sure that our budget is going to continue to protect our education, our public education at all levels, and fund public education, and our vulnerable populations, the disabled, those on Medicaid, those struggling to make ends meet. How is our budget going to still be impactful and helpful to those areas? And that's something that we need to continue to focus on.
I think we also need to mention there's another complication to all of this, right? Voters just said they approved at the ballot. this new $350 million fund to support law enforcement. That ballot measure dictated that the state has to fund this. And $350 million is a lot of money.
Especially in this budget.
Exactly. How are they going to incorporate this?
I think more of a background thing is a collective sigh from certain members, just like, oh my gosh, now we have to deal with this $350 million. But it doesn't have to be allocated immediately. So, I mean, that would be pretty impossible for this next session to even do that. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
But they do have to develop a way to implement it. And I think we will see some proposals on how that money is going to be spent. I'm kind of curious how broad the policies could be surrounding this. It's to retain and recruit police officers. So I'm wondering if we're going to see bills this session that would tap into this $350 million.
I was talking to Senate President James Coleman, and he said that we could see some funding start to flow into this year. But I think other lawmakers aren't so sure.
I think you bring up a good point here that other than this policy area, it is going to be extremely difficult to get any bill passed this legislative session that has a cost to it, that has a fiscal note.
That is correct.
This seems like the perfect transition to talk about what lawmakers might want to do this session, because even if they don't have any money, there's still things they want to do. So before we wrap this episode up, let's go through some of the big hits people should be keeping an eye out for as lawmakers get to work.
One fight we know is coming is over labor. There are some bills, or at least one major bill coming that's pro-workers' rights, pro-union, that would get rid of some unique barriers that Colorado has to forming a union. So this bill, it's coming from some progressive lawmakers. It would make it easier to form unions in Colorado. And there's some tension there with the governor, because he has a history of just this summer vetoing 2 bills that would have protected workers and what they're being paid from contractors. And he vetoed those bills. And there were some pretty significant protests outside his office in response to those vetoes. And he's already been a little skeptical of this labor bill that's coming. So that's going to definitely be a big fight to watch.
Yeah. How far lawmakers want to go versus the governor.
Exactly.
And you're right, he hasn't been overly friendly when it comes to workers' rights. I think another area where we could see some tension, and because this is a very complex, thorny issue, is artificial intelligence. We passed a first in the nation law last legislative session to try to prevent discrimination in AI systems. So this is when AI is part of a decision that would have a major impact on someone's life. Think housing, banking, education. There's a task force coming up with recommendations. Those recommendations drop in February. And we've heard the governor really want to make sure that no enforcement thwarts innovation and advancements in AI for like groundbreaking technology and things like that, and medical advancements. So, the governor hasn't said he's vetoing anything necessarily, but he's issued a warning that he wants to make sure it doesn't go too far.
Yeah, and that's kind of uncharted territory with this AI stuff. Democrats are also talking about Tabor, right? We talked a little bit about how Tabor is constraining the budget potentially, or some claim that it's constraining the budget.
Yes.
What are you hearing about Tabor legislation?
I heard from an incoming lawmaker, actually a freshman lawmaker, that he wants to try to tackle whether Tabor is meeting the state's needs. He didn't want to get into a lot of specifics. There was a lawsuit filed a while back saying it was unconstitutional that got struck down. I'm not saying this will be a lawsuit, but it sounds like Democrats are really thinking of something pretty significant that they could try to change Tabor, which really does limit growth. For Republicans, they see it as one of the things that's kept the state as strong and healthy as it is economically. So huge divergence there on the role of Tabor and what should happen.
A thorny issue, definitely. Speaking of money and budgets, on the cost of living side, I've been hearing about this one piece of legislation that would target price gouging at grocery stores. And there are some allegations. The bill sponsors have said that big grocery store companies use inflation to also jack up their prices. So this bill would address that price gouging by giving the Attorney General's office more power to investigate and hold these companies accountable if they price gouge on, what the bill considers necessities, groceries, milk, eggs, that kind of thing. It's one attempt to address this high grocery store prices, high cost of necessities that was really top of mind for Coloradans going into the election in November.
Oh, yeah, and I'm sure you heard this too. I really didn't talk to a voter who didn't mention high cost of living and prices.
Oh, across the board. I also want to bring up some things that we won't see much of this session, that we maybe have seen a lot of in recent years. For example, there was a big deal made last year between lawmakers, environmental groups, and oil and gas fossil fuel producers to hold off on any new oil and gas regulations until 2028. So I don't think we're really going to see a lot of legislation trying to regulate fossil fuels, even though a lot of people say that fossil fuels contribute greatly to the poor air quality, especially on the Front Range.
I'll also be curious. It doesn't seem like housing is going to be as big of a focus. That was certainly a priority for the governor the last couple sessions and Democrats, and some measures on renters' rights. I don't know if that'll be a focal point.
No, and I think similarly, we might see less of a focus on gun control bills. We've seen a lot of those in recent years, and I think they're lawmakers are seeing how the laws they've passed are implemented. And one of the biggest big-ticket items as far as gun control is concerned in the last few years, we've seen an attempt to pass a ban on assault-style weapons. That's probably unlikely to come back this year. There's still a lot of opposition to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's something that a lot of Democrats supported but didn't think it could really be implemented. The two Democrats who really championed that assault-style weapons ban, they both lost primary races early in the summer, in June, in the June primary.
Right.
I'm not saying it's because of the assault weapons ban, but for various reasons, they're not back at the Capitol. And to your point, some of the more prominent Democrats who've worked on passing stricter gun laws, one of them told me that she really wants to make sure the state has teeth in the laws that have already passed, 21 to purchase, the 3-day waiting period and things like that, and making sure it's being implemented.
Yeah, I've heard that from a few lawmakers, that they want to go back through the bills that they've passed and just make sure implementation is happening smoothly. So I think we're going to see some of that as well this session.
I mean, it does make sense when Democrats have passed a lot of their priorities and there's no new money to fund programs this session, that it would be a good chance to go back and check on, hey, what did we pass? Is it doing what we intended it to do?
Sounds like that is good practice in general for our lawmakers, isn't it?
Yes, it'll be our job to check in on how those check-ins actually go, what they find out, and if things do need to be tweaked.
Exactly.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us for the next few months.
That is for sure.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Capitol News Alliance.
The CNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
And I'm Benta Birkland. This episode was edited by Megan Verlee and Joe Erickson and produced by Shane Rumsey.
We'll be back in your feed soon and all throughout the session. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capitol News Alliance.